The month of October 1948 began rather frustratingly for the Israeli cleansing forces. The Galilee, especially in its upper parts, was still controlled by Palestinian volunteers, reinforced by Al-Qoghzi's ALA units. The latter could still be found in many villages in the northern Galilee, all part of the UN-designated Arab state, where they tried to wage a mini-guerrilla warfare against the armed Jewish forces, mainly in the form of sniper fire at convoys and troops. But theirs was an ineffective kind of resistance, largely in vain. October also saw the final futile attempt by regular forces from Lebanon to add their firepower in a last pathetic gesture of Arab solidarity as they shelled one Jewish settlement, Manara, high up in the Galilee. Down south in the lower Galilee, the Arab volunteers were left with one artillery gun in Ilabun. It symbolized their imminent and total collapse. Whatever resistance may still have existed was wiped out during the onslaught of Operation Hiram in the middle of the month. Hiram was the name of the biblical king of Tyre, which was one of the targets of this ambitious and expansionist scheme. Israel's takeover of the upper Galilee and southern Lebanon. With intensive artillery and air force attacks, Jewish troops captured both in a matter of 2 weeks. These 2 weeks now rank, together with a heroic struggle to save Wadi Ara, as one of the most impressive chapters in the history of the Palestinian resistance during the Nakba. The Israeli Air Force dropped about 10,000 leaflets calling upon the villagers to surrender, although not promising them any immunity from expulsion. None of the villages did, and almost as a whole came out to confront the Israeli forces. Thus, for a brief period, in courageous defiance of the vastly superior Israeli military power, Palestinian villages, for the first time since the ethnic cleansing started, turned themselves into strongholds, standing up to the besieging Israeli troops. A mixture of local youth and the remnants of the ALA were entrenched for a week or two, holding out with what meager arms they had before being overpowered by the assailants. 50 such brave men defended Ramaish. Others could be found in Deir al-Kashi, most of them in fact not locals but refugees from Safuriya, vowing not to be displaced again. They were commanded by a man called Abu Hamoud from the ALA. Unfortunately, we only have the names of a few officers from the Israeli intelligence files and oral histories, such as Abu Ibrahim, who defended Kfar Manda, but, like the Iraqi officers mentioned in the Wadi Ara campaign, they should all be written into the Palestinian and universal Book of Heroes, who did everything they could to try to prevent ethnic cleansing from taking place. Israel and the West in general refers to them anonymously and collectively as Arab insurgents or terrorists, as they have done with the Palestinians who fought within the PLO until the 1980s, and others who led the two uprisings against the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1987 and 2000. We have much more. I have no illusion that it will take more than this book to reverse a reality that demonizes a people who have been colonized, expelled, and occupied, and glorifies the very people who colonized, expelled, and occupied them. This handful of warriors of a sort were inevitably defeated, subjected to heavy bombardments from the air and fierce ground attacks. The ALA volunteers withdrew first, after which the local villagers decided to surrender, quite often through UN mediation. But a distinguishing feature of this phase in the Nakba was that the withdrawal of the volunteers, who by now had already spent 10 months in Palestine, only came about after they had desperately fought to defend the villages, quite often disobeying orders from their headquarters to leave. 400 such volunteers lost their lives in those days in October. The Israeli air bombardments were massive and caused a considerable amount of collateral damage to the Palestinian villages. Some villages suffered more than others from heavy pounding. Rama, Shuhmata, Malkiya, and Kfar Birim. Only Rama was left intact. The other three were occupied and destroyed. Most of the villages in the Upper Galilee were seized in a single day at the end of October. Deir Hana, Ilabun, Araba, Igrit, Faradiya, Mi'ila, Kirbat Iribin, Kfarinan, Tarbiha, Tarshiha, Mairun, Shafsaf, Shasha, Jis, Fasuta, and Kadita. The list is long and includes another 10 villages. Some villagers were evicted, some were allowed to stay. The main question about those days is no longer why villages were expelled, but rather why some were allowed to remain, obviously almost always as a result of the decision made by a local commander. Why was Jis left intact and nearby Kadita and Mairun expelled by force? And why was Rama spared while nearby Safshaf was totally demolished? It is hard to tell, and much of what follows is based on speculation. Located on the well-traveled road between Acre and Safad, the village of Rama was already overcrowded, having earlier taken in a large number of refugees from other villages. The size of the village, but quite possibly its large Druze community, were two factors that probably influenced the local decision not to expel its population. However, even for villages that were allowed to stay, scores, sometimes hundreds of their inhabitants were imprisoned in POW camps or expelled to Lebanon. In fact, the Hebrew noun tihur, cleansing, assumed new meanings in October. It still described, as before, the total expulsion and destruction of a village, but it could now also represent other activities, such as selective search and expulsion operations. While Israel's divide and rule policy proved effective in the case of the Druze, to whom it promised not only immunity but also arms as rewards for their collaboration, the Christian communities were less cooperative. Israeli troops at first routinely deported them together with the Muslims, but then started transferring them to transit camps in the central coastal areas. In October, Muslims rarely remained long in these camps but were transported, in the language of the Israeli army, to Lebanon. But Christians were now offered a different deal. In return for a vow of allegiance to the Jewish state, they were allowed to return to their villages for a short time. To their credit, most of the Christians refused to participate willingly in such a selection process. Uh, As a result, the army soon meted out the same treatment to Christian as to Muslim villages, where they did not have a Druze population. Instead of waiting to be deported, imprisoned, or killed, many villagers simply ran away. Heavy bombardments in advance of the occupation precipitated the flight of many villagers, varying in numbers from case to case. But in most instances, the majority of the people bravely stayed put until they were forcibly uprooted. Additionally, it would appear that during the very last days of October, the cleansing stamina of the Israeli troops was beginning to wane because villages with large populations were eventually allowed to stay. This may help explain why Tarshiha, Deir Hana, and Ilabun are still intact today.